Los Angeles, January 15, 1947. The City of Angels was experiencing the post-war boom that would define the American dream for generations. Hollywood was king, the sun was shining, and Betty Bersinger was taking a morning walk with her 3-year-old daughter through a vacant lot in the Lamert Park neighborhood. At 10:30 a.m., Betty thought she saw a mannequin lying in the weeds, pale, waxy, cut in half at the waist. It took several seconds for her mind to process what her eyes were seeing. This wasn't a department store dummy. This was a human being, a young woman, brutally murdered and posed like a grotesque work of art. The body belonged to 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, an aspiring actress whose dreams of Hollywood stardom had ended in unimaginable horror. The killer had spent days mutilating her body, draining her blood, and arranging her remains for maximum shock value. This wasn't just murder, it was a statement, a signature, the work of someone whose intent went far beyond simply taking a life. But here's what's most shocking about this case. Within 72 hours, LAPD investigators had a prime suspect, someone with clear motive, someone who knew the victim, someone whose behavior immediately after the murder screamed guilt to everyone who encountered him. So why, nearly 80 years later, is the Black Dahlia murder still unsolved? Why did a case with a clear suspect become one of America's most notorious cold cases? The answer lies in a perfect storm of investigative failures, media interference, and a psychological phenomenon that turns certainty into chaos: cognitive overload. When you have too many suspects, every suspect becomes invisible. When you're drowning in evidence, the truth disappears beneath the surface. And when you're staring directly at the answers but can't filter out the noise, proximity becomes blindness. Welcome to Deadly Intent, the podcast that examines the psychology behind the crime. I'm Carmen Carrion, and today we're diving into one of America's most famous unsolved murders, the Black Dahlia case. Intent. It's what separates murder from massacre, signature from chaos, justice from failure. As the criminologist Robert Ressler once noted, the killer's intent isn't just reflected in how they kill, it's reflected in how they want to be remembered. The murder we're examining today demonstrates intent in its most calculated form. Not just the intent to kill, but the intent to shock, to terrorize, and to create a lasting mark on the collective consciousness. This is the story of a killer whose signature was so distinctive that it should have led directly to his capture, and an investigation so overwhelmed by its own success that it failed to see the forest for the trees. But this case forces us to examine uncomfortable questions about investigative psychology. When does thoroughness become paralysis? When does having multiple suspects become having no suspects? And what happens when the very evidence that should solve a case becomes the reason it remains unsolved? On January 9, 1947, Elizabeth Short checked out of the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She told the desk clerk she was meeting someone. She was seen in the hotel lobby, looking nervous but expectant, as if waiting for an appointment that mattered. She walked out into the California evening and vanished for 6 days. When her body was found on January 15th, it was clear that Elizabeth Short's final week had been a nightmare beyond imagination. But before we examine the horror of her death, we need to understand who Elizabeth Short really was, because the media mythology that developed around her death has obscured the real person whose life was stolen. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe Short. Her early life was marked by tragedy and instability. When Elizabeth was 6 years old, her father abandoned the family during the Great Depression, leaving her mother to raise 5 daughters alone. Phoebe Short moved the family to California when Elizabeth was a teenager, hoping for better opportunities. Elizabeth, who had always been fascinated by movies and movie stars, saw California as her chance to make her own Hollywood dreams come true. Those who knew Elizabeth Short described her as strikingly beautiful, but deeply insecure. She was tall and slender with pale skin, dark hair, and classic features that felt out of place in post-war Los Angeles. Elizabeth favored dramatic makeup, dark lipstick, heavy eyeliner, and often dressed entirely in black, a style that stood out sharply in the 1940s. Among friends, this earned her a casual nickname, referencing a popular noir film of the era, the Black Dahlia. After her murder, the press seized on that imagery, darkened it, and transformed it into the Black Dahlia, a name that turned a young woman into a headline, and a life into a symbol. But Elizabeth Short was never the promiscuous party girl that the media would later portray. Friends remembered her as surprisingly innocent for someone trying to break into Hollywood. She didn't drink alcohol due to asthma and other health issues. She rarely dated. And when she did, relationships often ended quickly because of her reluctance to become intimate. What Elizabeth lacked in connections, she made up for in determination. She waitressed, worked as a clerk, and took any job that would allow her to stay in Los Angeles and pursue acting. She lived in a series of boarding houses and small apartments, always just scraping by, always hoping that the next audition would be the one that changed everything. The winter of 1946-47 found Elizabeth at a particularly vulnerable point in her life. She had been staying with friends in San Diego, but had worn out her welcome. She had returned to Los Angeles with little money and few prospects. Friends later described her as increasingly desperate, willing to take risks she might have avoided under better circumstances. According to those who knew her during her final weeks, Elizabeth was actively seeking some kind of opportunity, whether romantic or professional, that might improve her situation. She had been more social than usual, meeting new people, accepting invitations from acquaintances she didn't know well. This vulnerability, this willingness to trust strangers, would ultimately cost Elizabeth her life. Betty Bersinger's discovery of Elizabeth Short's body on the morning of January 15, 1947, shocked even veteran Los Angeles detectives who thought they'd seen everything. The scene was surreal in its clinical precision. The body had been severed completely in half at the waist, not hacked or torn, but cut with the precision of someone with surgical training. Both halves had been carefully cleaned and drained of blood until the skin appeared waxy and white, like marble. The killer had washed the body so thoroughly that not a trace of blood remained on the skin or grass beneath it. Elizabeth's body was positioned with theatrical deliberation. The upper half lay on its back, arms positioned above her head in a pose that seemed almost peaceful, if not for the horrific mutilation. The lower half was placed exactly 10 inches away, legs spread in a position calculated for maximum shock and degradation. Even the way the body was oriented, perpendicular to the sidewalk, impossible to miss, suggested someone who wanted his work discovered and displayed. The mutilation was extensive and appeared to be performed with surgical precision. The killer had carved a smile into Elizabeth's face from ear to ear, creating the horrifying Glasgow smile that would become the case's most infamous detail. Her breasts had been mutilated, and there was evidence of extensive torture before death. Most disturbing was the evidence that Elizabeth had been kept alive for days while being tortured. The torture wasn't random violence. It was methodical, calculated, designed to maximize suffering while keeping the victim conscious and aware. What struck investigators immediately was the clinical nature of the mutilation. This wasn't the work of someone in a violent rage. This was someone who had taken their time, who had access to medical knowledge or training, and who had intended from the beginning to create exactly this scene. Dr. Frederick Newbar, who performed the autopsy, concluded that Elizabeth had died from hemorrhage and shock due to concussion of the brain and lacerations of the face. But his report also noted that the killer had demonstrated considerable anatomical knowledge in how the body was severed and cleaned. The crime scene told a story of a killer whose intent went beyond murder. This was someone who wanted to shock the community, terrorize women, and create a lasting monument to their own evil. The careful positioning of the body, the theatrical nature of the display, everything suggested a killer who saw himself as an artist of death. Detective Harry Hansen of the LAPD's University Division caught the case alongside Detective Finis Brown, and initial progress was remarkably promising. Within hours, investigators had identified the victim through fingerprints. Elizabeth's prints were on file because she had been arrested for underage drinking in Santa Barbara in 1943. The timeline of Elizabeth's final days emerged with unusual clarity for a 1940s investigation. She had been staying with Dorothy and Elvira French in Pacific Beach, near San Diego, through most of December 1946 and early January 1947. The French sisters described Elizabeth as increasingly anxious about her financial situation and eager to return to Los Angeles, where she believed better opportunities awaited. On January 8th, she convinced Red Manley, a married traveling salesman who had been pursuing her romantically, to drive her to Los Angeles. Manley was initially considered a prime suspect. He was the last person known to have seen Elizabeth alive, and his story had some inconsistencies. But Manley's account checked out under scrutiny. He had driven Elizabeth to the Biltmore Hotel on the evening of January 9th, where she told him she was meeting her sister. Elizabeth had no sister in Los Angeles. Hotel staff confirmed seeing Elizabeth in the lobby that evening, apparently waiting for someone. She appeared nervous but expectant, checking the time frequently and watching the hotel entrance. Security cameras, a rarity in 1947, captured Elizabeth leaving the hotel around 10 p.m. on January 9th. She was walking with a man in a dark coat, but the image quality was too poor to make an identification. This unknown companion would become the key to everything. Between January 9th and January 15th, Elizabeth Short simply vanished. No confirmed sightings, no hotel registrations, no credit card records or phone calls to trace her movements. For 6 days, she existed in a shadow world with her killer. The investigation would eventually focus on numerous suspects, but it wouldn't be until 1949, over 2 years later, that police would identify their most viable suspect, Dr. George Hill Hodel. For over 2 years, the Black Dahlia investigation floundered through hundreds of suspects and false leads. But in 1949, a shocking incest trial would bring the case's most viable suspect into focus. Dr. George Hill Hodel came to police attention not through brilliant detective work, but through family tragedy, when his 14-year-old daughter Tamar accused him of rape in October 1949. The resulting trial would expose a man whose profile matched everything investigators had theorized about Elizabeth Short's killer. Born in 1907, Hodel was a brilliant, wealthy physician with surgical knowledge who had demonstrated a pattern of violence toward women. But he was also sophisticated enough to cover his tracks and connected enough to influence the investigation. He was a child prodigy who graduated from college at 15 and completed medical school by age 24. By 1947, he was one of Los Angeles' most prominent physicians, running a successful practice that served Hollywood elite and wealthy socialites. During Tamar's testimony, despite 3 witnesses testifying they had seen Hodel having sex with his daughter, she made an explosive claim that would change the course of the Black Dahlia investigation. She told the court that her father had once bragged to her about killing a woman in Los Angeles, showing her newspaper clippings about the Black Dahlia case. Despite his testimony and corroborating witnesses, Hodel was acquitted in December 1949, but the trial had revealed disturbing patterns that immediately caught the attention of Black Dahlia investigators. Hodel was involved in Los Angeles art scene, particularly the Surrealist movement, which emphasized shocking imagery and the violation of social taboos. The Surrealist connection would prove crucial to understanding the Black Dahlia murder. Hodel was friends with artists like Man Ray, whose photos often featured nude women posed in disturbing artistic arrangements. The staging of Elizabeth Short's body, the careful positioning, the clinical precision, the theatrical display, matched the aesthetic principles Hodel would have known intimately from the art world. Hodel lived in the Lloyd Wright-designed Soden House, a fortress-like mansion at 5121 Franklin Avenue that locals called the Jaws House because of its intimidating Mayan-inspired architecture. The house was perfect for someone who needed to commit crimes undetected. Built into a hillside with thick concrete walls, it was essentially soundproof. The basement contained a network of tunnels and hidden rooms that Wright had designed for privacy, but could easily have been used for imprisonment and torture. Most importantly, investigators discovered that Hodel had connections to Elizabeth Short. Multiple witnesses placed them together in the weeks before her murder. A bartender at the Formosa Cafe remembered seeing them together on at least 3 occasions. In late December 1946, a parking attendant at the Ambassador Hotel recalled seeing Elizabeth get into Hodel's distinctive black sedan. Elizabeth's friend Ann Toth later told investigators that Elizabeth had mentioned dating a doctor who lived in a weird house and drove a fancy car. Toth said Elizabeth seemed both fascinated and frightened by this man, describing him as brilliant but cruel. Perhaps most damning was testimony from Elvira French, one of the sisters Elizabeth had been staying with in San Diego. French told police that Elizabeth had received several phone calls from a man who identified himself as Dr. George. The caller had offered to help Elizabeth with her career and had arranged to meet her when she returned to Los Angeles. French described the caller as having a cultured voice and sophisticated manner of speaking. Elizabeth seemed excited about the opportunity, but also nervous about the man. She said he was important and could help her, French later recalled. But there was something about him that made her uncomfortable. Following Hodel's acquittal in the incest case, investigators finally had enough evidence to justify intensive surveillance of their prime suspect. Between February 18th and March 27, 1950, over 3 years after Elizabeth Short's murder, the LAPD and District Attorney's Office placed listening devices in the Soden house and began round-the-clock monitoring of Hodel's activities and conversations. What they recorded was extraordinary and extraordinarily damning. During the surveillance period, Hodel was captured in conversation with an unidentified visitor, saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." The reference to his secretary was particularly chilling. Hodel's office manager, Ruth Spaulding, had died under mysterious circumstances in January 1945, exactly 2 years before Elizabeth Short's murder. Spaulding had supposedly committed suicide by overdosing on barbiturates, but the circumstances were suspicious enough that some investigators believed she had been murdered. But the surveillance recordings contained even more damaging admissions. In another recorded conversation, Hodel was heard saying, "They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they might have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary." These weren't hypothetical musings or dark humor. These were admissions recorded by official police surveillance in a murder investigation. In any normal case, these recordings would have been enough to obtain a search warrant, make an arrest, and build a prosecutable case. Instead, the recordings were filed away and forgotten. Official reasons were never given for why the surveillance was discontinued or why the admissions weren't pursued. But the unofficial reason was becoming clear. George Hodel had powerful friends who were protecting him. Even more frustrating for investigators, the surveillance had captured Hodel in conversations about other suspicious deaths connected to him. He had been heard discussing the deaths of several young women who had died under mysterious circumstances after being seen with him. To investigators listening to the recordings, it was becoming clear that Elizabeth Short might have been just one victim in a series of murders. But instead of leading to arrests, the surveillance evidence disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. Detective Hansen found himself reassigned to other cases. The Black Dahlia investigation was officially still active, but the focus had shifted away from its most viable suspect. So why wasn't George Hodel arrested and charged with Elizabeth Short's murder? The answer reveals the darker side of 1940s Los Angeles, where wealth, connections, and corruption could literally get away with murder. Dr. Hodel wasn't just wealthy. He was connected to the power structure that ran Los Angeles. His medical practice included judges, police officials, district attorneys, and politicians among its clients. More importantly, he had compromising information about many of these powerful men. Through his Soden House parties, Hodel had created a network of influential people who attended gatherings where illegal activities, drugs, prostitution, sexual assault, were commonplace. Many attendees were prominent figures who couldn't afford to have their participation exposed. This gave Hodel leverage over the very people who should have been prosecuting him. The corruption went deeper than just social connections. Evidence suggests that key figures within the LAPD and District Attorney's Office were actively protecting Hodel. When Detective Hansen tried to pursue the surveillance evidence, he found himself blocked by his own superiors. When he requested search warrants for the Soden House, his paperwork mysteriously disappeared. When he tried to interview witnesses who could place Hodel with Elizabeth Short, he was told they were no longer available. In 1950, Hansen was quietly transferred to another division and told to stop investigating the Hodel connection. The official reason was that the case needed fresh eyes, but Hansen knew he was being punished for getting too close to the truth. The pattern of protection became even more obvious during Hodel's 1949 trial for molesting his daughter Tamar. Despite extensive evidence and credible testimony from Tamar, Hodel was acquitted. The defense successfully portrayed Tamar as a troubled teenager, but what wasn't revealed at the time was that key witnesses had been intimidated into changing their testimony, and crucial evidence had been declared inadmissible on technical grounds. Immediately after his acquittal, George Hodel sold the Soden House and fled to the Philippines, where he would live for the next several decades. His hasty departure from Los Angeles, right after beating serious criminal charges, looked like the actions of someone who knew his luck might not hold forever. From the Philippines, Hodel built a new life as a medical administrator, eventually becoming health director for several provinces. He married a Filipino woman and had additional children. To outside observers, he appeared to be a successful American expatriate, pursuing humanitarian work in Southeast Asia. But even from thousands of miles away, Hodel's influence in Los Angeles continued to protect him. Whenever the Black Dahlia case was reopened or reinvestigated, leads pointing to Hodel were somehow overlooked or dismissed. Files went missing. Witnesses became unavailable. Evidence was ruled inadmissible or unreliable. The pattern was so consistent that some investigators began to suspect that Hodel had left behind more than just memories. He had left behind people who were still protecting his secrets. But corruption and cover-ups weren't the only factors that allowed George Hodel to escape justice. The Black Dahlia case also became a victim of its own notoriety, creating a perfect storm of investigative failures that transformed what should have been a solvable case into chaos. The case generated unprecedented media attention. Newspapers across the country covered every development, creating enormous public pressure for quick results. The LAPD received over 500 tips in the first week alone. By February 1947, the investigation had accumulated over 500 named suspects, 60 people who confessed to the murder, thousands of tips and leads, hundreds of alleged sightings of Elizabeth Short in her final days, multiple claimed relationships with the victim. This overwhelming volume of information created what psychologists call cognitive overload, a state where the human brain simply cannot process the amount of data it's receiving. Instead of helping the investigation, the abundance of tips and suspects created paralysis. Detective Hansen found himself buried under paperwork, following up on leads that led nowhere, investigating confessions from obviously disturbed individuals seeking attention. Each false lead required hours or days to properly investigate and eliminate, consuming resources that should have been focused on viable suspects, like Dr. Hodel. The media attention also compromised the investigation in more direct ways. Reporters were paying informants for tips, creating financial incentives for false information. Crime scene details leaked to the press were then incorporated into false confessions, making it impossible to distinguish between legitimate suspects and attention seekers who read the newspaper coverage. But the most devastating failure wasn't the chaos surrounding the case. It was what investigators did with their prime suspect. Dr. George Hodel should have been arrested in March 1947. Detective Hansen had identified him as the primary suspect. The evidence was compelling and growing stronger. Surveillance was recording potentially incriminating conversations. Instead, the investigation got distracted by other suspects. A sailor had been stationed in Los Angeles. A transient had been seen near the vacant lot. A dozen other men with violent histories and questionable alibis. This phenomenon, focusing on less viable suspects while overlooking the most obvious one, is what forensic psychologists call proximity blindness. When investigators are overwhelmed with options, they often overlook the suspect right in front of them in favor of more exotic or dramatic possibilities. Dr. Hodel was wealthy, educated, socially prominent. He didn't fit the stereotype of what a brutal killer should look like. The other suspects were more obviously criminal, more traditionally suspicious. In the chaos of hundreds of suspects, Hodel began to look ordinary by comparison. The surveillance recordings that should have been smoking gun evidence were instead filed away as investigators chased more sensational leads. The witness testimony placing Hodel with Elizabeth Short was overshadowed by dozens of other claimed sightings. The perfect crime scene, his fortress-like mansion with its secret rooms, was overlooked in favor of investigating parks, vacant lots, and hotel rooms suggested by various tips. The media coverage of the Black Dahlia case created its own destructive intent, the intent to sensationalize rather than solve. Newspapers turned Elizabeth Short into a mythological figure, focusing on lurid details of her death while ignoring the investigative realities. The coverage created a feedback loop that made solving the case more difficult with each passing day. The more sensational the coverage became, the more false tips and confessions poured in. The more suspects the police investigated, the more the real suspect disappeared into the crowd. Some reporters went beyond just covering the case. They actively interfered with it. The Los Angeles Examiner claimed to have received letters and packages from the killer, though these were almost certainly hoaxes designed to sell newspapers. But police were forced to investigate each claimed communication, further diluting their resources. The media also created a mythology around Elizabeth Short herself that obscured the reality of who she was and whom she might have been with during her final days. The Black Dahlia legend portrayed her as a femme fatale with dozens of lovers, when the reality was that she was a relatively innocent young woman who knew far fewer people than the press suggested. This mythology made it easier to dismiss witness accounts of her relationship with Dr. Hodel. If Elizabeth knew everyone, then knowing Hodel wasn't especially significant. If she was constantly dating different men, then being seen with a wealthy doctor was just another random encounter. Looking back at the evidence with the benefit of hindsight, the killer's intent becomes clear. This wasn't just murder. It was performance art designed to create maximum psychological impact. The careful staging of the body, the theatrical mutilation, the clinical precision of the torture, all of it suggests someone who saw himself as creating a masterpiece. The killer wanted to shock the community, terrorize women, and establish himself as the author of something that would never be forgotten. Dr. George Hodel fits this profile perfectly. As someone connected to the Surrealist art movement, he would have been familiar with the concept of shocking the bourgeoisie through transgressive art. The staging of Elizabeth Short's body mirrors Surrealist photographs and paintings that used the human form to create disturbing, unforgettable images. The extensive torture before death suggests someone who derived pleasure, not just from killing, but from the process of killing. This points to a sadistic personality with psychopathic traits, someone capable of maintaining emotional detachment while inflicting maximum suffering. The killer's success in evading capture also suggests high intelligence and social sophistication. This wasn't someone operating on the margins of society. This was someone with resources, knowledge, and the social status to avoid suspicion. In later years, it would become clear just how close the LAPD came to solving the Black Dahlia case in 1947. Dr. George Hodel remained their prime suspect for months, but the investigation was ultimately abandoned due to lack of definitive evidence. What the investigators didn't know was that they were fighting against more than just the chaos of an overwhelming case. They were fighting against corruption within their own department. Years later, it would be revealed that Dr. Hodel had powerful connections throughout Los Angeles, including within the LAPD itself. His medical practice served many wealthy and influential clients. His social connections included judges, politicians, and police officials who had the power to influence or derail investigations. It's entirely possible that Dr. Hodel escaped justice, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because he had the connections to ensure that evidence was never properly pursued. Detective Hansen, the lead investigator, left the case frustrated and convinced that political pressure had prevented him from making an arrest he believed was justified by the evidence. Dr. George Hill Hodel died in 1999, taking whatever secrets he possessed to his grave. But his death would unleash an investigation more thorough than anything the LAPD had conducted in 1947. Steve Hodel, George Hodel's son and retired LAPD detective with 24 years of experience, began investigating his father as the Black Dahlia killer in 1999. What started as casual curiosity about his father's past became an obsession when Steve began finding evidence that had somehow eluded police for over 50 years. Among his father's possessions, Steve discovered photographs that appeared to show Elizabeth Short posing in the weeks before her death. The photos showed a young woman in Elizabeth's distinctive features and build, photographed in artistic poses that matched the surrealist aesthetic George Hodel was known to favor. Even more damning were the crime scene photographs Steve found among his father's belongings. These weren't newspaper photos or official police images. These appeared to be personal photographs taken at the scene, suggesting that whoever took them had been present when Elizabeth Short's body was discovered or shortly afterward. Steve also found what appeared to be Elizabeth Short's personal effects among his father's possessions: jewelry, clothing items, and personal photographs that had never been recovered by police. The provenance of these items couldn't be definitively established, but their presence in George Hodel's possession was deeply suspicious. Perhaps most chilling was Steve's analysis of his father's handwriting, compared to the letters allegedly sent to newspapers by Elizabeth's killer. Several newspapers had received letters claiming to be the Black Dahlia Avenger, threatening to kill again and taunting police about their inability to solve the case. Handwriting experts consulted by Steve concluded that the letters were likely written by George Hodel. Steve's investigation also revealed connections between his father and other unsolved murders from the 1940s Los Angeles area: the red lipstick murder of Jeannie French in 1947, the torture murder of Gladys Kern in 1948, the disappearance and presumed murder of Geneva Elroy in 1958. All of these cases shared similarities with Elizabeth Short's murder: extreme mutilation, evidence of extended torture, surgical precision in the dismemberment, and staging that suggested the killer was making an artistic statement. All occurred during periods when George Hodel was living in Los Angeles and had access to the locations where the bodies were found. Steve's investigation convinced him that his father wasn't just Elizabeth Short's killer. He was a serial killer, responsible for potentially dozens of murders over a period of several decades. Despite Steve Hodel's compelling evidence, the Black Dahlia case remains officially unsolved. The LAPD has reviewed Steve's findings but has not reopened the investigations or declared George Hodel the official suspect. Part of the reason is practical. With George Hodel dead and the physical evidence from 1947 long since compromised or lost, there's no possibility of prosecution. Officially solving the case would require a level of certainty that might be impossible to achieve nearly 80 years after the crime. But there may be other reasons for the LAPD's reluctance to embrace Steve Hodel's findings. Officially acknowledging George Hodel as the Black Dahlia killer would also mean acknowledging that the case was solvable in 1947, that corruption and incompetence allowed a killer to escape justice, and that one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history was actually solved decades ago. Such an admission would raise uncomfortable questions about other unsolved cases from the same era. If George Hodel was protected by corruption in the Black Dahlia case, how many other killers escaped justice through similar protection? How many families were denied justice because of institutional failures? The killer's intent to escape justice was ultimately fulfilled, not through criminal genius, but through a combination of corruption, investigative overload, and institutional protection that allowed him to live freely for over 50 years after his crimes. In all the sensationalism and mythology that has grown up around the Black Dahlia case, it's important to remember that Elizabeth Short was a real person whose life was stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. Elizabeth was just 22 years old when she died. She had dreams of becoming an actress, hopes of finding love, plans for a future that never arrived. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's potential everything. The killer's intent was to reduce her to an object, to transform her from a human being into a grotesque work of art designed to shock and terrorize. In some ways, he succeeded. Elizabeth Short became famous not for her life, but for her death, not for her dreams, but for her nightmares. But Elizabeth deserves to be remembered as more than just a victim. She was a young woman trying to make her way in the world, pursuing her dreams against difficult odds. She was kind to friends, loyal to family, and hopeful about her future even when circumstances were challenging. The tragedy isn't just that she was murdered. It's that her murder became more famous than her life. Her killer's intent to create a lasting monument to evil succeeded in ways that the intent to find justice did not. The Black Dahlia case offers sobering lessons about how good intentions can lead to investigative failure. The LAPD's desire to be thorough, to investigate every lead, to take every tip seriously, ultimately sabotaged their ability to focus on the most viable suspect. Modern criminal investigations have learned from cases like this one. Today's investigators understand the importance of suspect prioritization, evidence management, and media relations in ways that weren't understood in 1947. The concept of cognitive overload is now recognized as a serious threat to complex investigations. Modern police departments have protocols for managing high-profile cases that generate enormous public interest and multiple suspects. But the most important lesson may be about danger of proximity blindness. Sometimes the answer to a mystery isn't hidden. It's right there in plain sight, waiting for investigators who have the clarity to see past the chaos and focus on what really matters. Nearly 80 years after Elizabeth Short's murder, questions remain that may never be answered. Was Dr. George Hodel protected by corruption within the LAPD? Did his social and professional connections allow him to literally get away with murder? Were there other victims? Steve Hodel's research suggests his father may have been a serial killer, responsible for multiple unsolved murders in 1940s Los Angeles, and later, even more murders in the Philippines. Could the case still be solved? While George Hodel is dead, physical evidence may still exist that could provide definitive answers using modern forensic techniques. What we do know is that the investigation failed, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because investigators couldn't see the forest for the trees. They were drowning in suspects, while the real killer hid in plain sight. The Black Dahlia case represents more than just an unsolved murder. It represents the complete failure of the justice system when confronted with power, corruption, and institutional self-protection. Elizabeth Short's killer didn't escape through criminal genius or investigative incompetence alone. He escaped because the system was designed to protect people like him at the expense of victims like her. Dr. George Hodel succeeded in his primary goal, to kill with impunity. He understood that wealth, connections, and social status could provide immunity from consequences. And he was right. The evidence against him was overwhelming by any reasonable standard, but reasonable standards didn't apply to someone with his advantages. The investigation's failure wasn't primarily about cognitive overload or media interference. Though both played roles, it was about a system that valued protecting the powerful more than pursuing truth for the powerless. Elizabeth Short was a nobody from Massachusetts with Hollywood dreams. George Hodel was a connected physician with powerful friends throughout Los Angeles. When those two worlds collided, there was never any doubt about which one the system would protect. The Black Dahlia murder became a permanent part of American mythology, inspiring countless books, movies, and theories that keep the horror alive nearly 80 years later. Elizabeth Short became famous not for her life or dreams, but for the brutal way she died. Her killer achieved a kind of immortality through his crimes, while she became frozen forever as a victim rather than remembered as the person she was trying to become. Yet it was something fitting about the fact that it was George Hodel's own son who ultimately exposed the truth. Steve Hodel's investigation represents justice refusing to die, even when official channels fail. The evidence he uncovered proves that truth has a way of emerging, even when powerful forces conspire to bury it. George Hodel may have escaped earthly justice, but he did not escape judgment. The evidence of his guilt is now part of the historical record, and his name will forever be associated with the crimes he committed. His plan to kill and disappear was ultimately defeated by the same thing he tried to destroy: the human refusal to let evil triumph completely. The intent behind the Black Dahlia murder was to demonstrate the ultimate power, the power to kill with impunity, to destroy innocence without consequences, to show that some people are simply above the law. In 1947, that intent was fulfilled completely through a combination of corruption, institutional protection, and systematic failures that valued protecting the powerful over pursuing justice for the powerless. But time has a way of exposing truth, even when institutions fail. Through the dedicated investigation of Steve Hodel, the continued work of researchers and journalists, and the refusal of people to let Elizabeth Short be forgotten, the truth about her murder has finally emerged. George Hodel may have escaped legal justice, but he did not escape historical judgment. The real tragedy of the Black Dahlia case isn't just that a killer escaped. It's what that escape reveals about a system designed to protect predators when they have enough wealth and connections. Elizabeth Short's murder was solvable in 1947, but solving it would have required confronting powerful people who were more valuable to the system than justice for a young woman with Hollywood dreams. Dr. Hodel succeeded in killing Elizabeth Short and escaping immediate consequences, but he failed in his ultimate intent to disappear without a trace. His crimes are now part of the historical record, and his name will forever be associated with the evil he committed. The evidence against him has only grown stronger with time, while the corruption that protected him has been exposed and condemned. Elizabeth Short deserved better. Better protection, better investigation, better justice. She deserved to be remembered for the person she was trying to become, rather than the brutal way she died. Though legal justice was denied her, historical justice has finally been served. Her killer has been identified, his methods exposed, and his intent to escape all consequences ultimately defeated. Remember, every killer has a reason, but does reason ever justify murder? In the case of the Black Dahlia, whatever twisted reasons drove George Hodel to commit such horrific acts, they can never justify the destruction of Elizabeth Short's life or the corruption that allowed him to escape justice. Power and privilege may delay accountability, but they cannot prevent it forever. Justice may be corrupted, delayed, or denied, but the intent to find truth never expires, even when institutions fail, even when the powerful protect their own, even when decades pass without resolution. The truth remains, waiting to be discovered by those with the courage to pursue it. I'm Carmen Carrion, and this has been Deadly Intent. Thank you for listening. And remember, the intent to find truth and justice never expires, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against it.